Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much for the introduction, David. I guess I just call myself an economist, but data visualization historian is also a nice title. So what I'm doing is to give a very long-term perspective on global development, on how living conditions changed. And I'm publishing this research. I'm aggregating a lot of research on a web publication which is called ourworldindata.org. And from this publication, it's a freely available web publication, I chose a couple of visualizations that tell us the story about global prosperity and global poverty. And in all of the work that I'm doing, I take a very long-term perspective. And the idea there is, as David was saying, that if you take this very long perspective, you understand where we are coming from, and you also understand where we are now, and you understand in which direction the world is moving. So it's all about the direction of change, finding the best data and map that out. To start with the story about global prosperity, we move far back. This first chart shows you income levels for the UK, the US, Japan, and then world average, going all the way back to the year 1000, and then you see it here until 1820. You see that you don't see much on this chart, and that's kind of the point. Income levels are very flat before 1820. These incomes are expressed in today's monetary terms, so they're adjusted for inflation. Economic historians spend their lives going around looking through data, looking, for example, at records of cathedral builders and noting down their wages. And then they go around and look at prices. They look at the price of clothes, and they look at soap, and they look at food prices so that they get real income. So you can adjust it over time with limitations. Until 1820, it's very flat, but this changes dramatically after that. If we move forward and show the data for the UK, we see this massive spike. So economic history is really a simple story. For a long time, we have very low incomes below $2,000 in today's money, and then we have this massive increase of economic growth. The US follows a little later, starts a little later, but then actually overtakes the UK and has even higher income than the UK. Japan starts yet a little later, but almost catches up with what is happening in the UK. And then for the world average, we also see that the average income of the people in the world also increased. And in this talk, I want to do two things. I want to look at how this is possible that incomes increase, and I want to look at I want to go beyond the average and actually look at the distribution of incomes for the world. To understand how incomes grow, we go back in time to 1688, the time when incomes were very low and income levels and people very poor. In today's monetary terms now in English pounds, it's 1,177 pounds per person per year. On average for people in England and Wales, and income inequality was also very high at the time, so for a lot of people, incomes are actually lower than 1,177 pounds. And you can imagine if you would have this little money, the things that you would buy are the very essential goods. A lot of money is spent on food and beverages, clothing and footwear, and then most of your money is actually gone. And a little goes to taxes, shown in green at the top, and for a lot of very important aspects of your life, like entertainment or education, there's very little money left to spend on that, because it goes all to the essentials. Now, we want to see how incomes, and incomes are, of course, like the total of your income also is always equal to the total of your expenditure that is shown in this chart. If you want to compare this from 1688 to today, we actually have to rescale the y-axis. So 1,177 shrinks all the way to the bottom here. And if we add then 2014, we see how much richer the average person in this country is. Average income today, 27,714 for 2014, that's the latest number. And if you look at how this income is actually spent, you see how much economic growth actually matters for your life. A lot less is spent as a share on food and drinks, but if you compare the actual amount of money that is spent on food and drinks, you see that it is much more than in 1688. The orange bar at the bottom is actually much higher. In fact, it is higher than the total income of the average person in 1688. So we have a much richer diet. And then for the other essential categories, it's also a relatively smaller share, and a lot more money is left to spend on entertainment, on an education. So this is what economic growth means for you. You get a much richer life in a very literal meaning. How is that possible? How do incomes grow? To look at that, we want to go into more detail and look at one particular question, namely, how long do you have to work to afford 1 hour of reading light? For anyone who has ever been to a place where there is no light after sunset, you know how poor your life is and how important it is to have a light after sunset. And to afford 1 hour of reading light, like to compare the price for 1 hour of reading light has the nice advantage that it's something that you care about and that is very comparable across time. For a lot of other things like food and clothes, it is much more difficult to compare across time. So if we go to 1800 and ask the question, how much do you have to work for reading lights? The way to get light into your house are candles, and it turns out you actually have to work more than 5 hours to afford an hour of reading light, which means that, of course, only a small share of the population can actually afford to light their house after dark, and most of the people are living in darkness once the sun sets. And for all of you who live in England, you know how dark these winters are here. Move forward to 1880, we have a new technology. Kerosene lamps are coming along, and if you want to get an hour of reading light out of kerosene lamps, you have to put in only 13 minutes. So this is starting to tell us how economic growth actually works. If we move forward to the 20th century, you have the light bulb, and to get an hour of reading light out of the light bulb, you have to work less than 4 seconds. Move forward to 1992, you have the CF bulbs, and you have to actually work less than half a second to get an hour of reading light. And if you want to go all the way today, you might want to have it very cheap and light your house with LEDs, and you have to actually work less than 1/10 of a second. So the crucial bit here is that you get more out for the work that you put in. So it is productivity that is at the very heart of that. Oh, this equal sign moved around. So productivity is what you get out in relation to what you put in. And this is the crucial bit, the crucial lever for income growth. A bit more poetic way to express the same was expressed by Henry David Thoreau, who said, "The price of anything is the amount of life you exchange for it." And this is also another consequence of that is that we actually put in less work, and working hours over this long time frame that we're looking at actually reduced massively from more than 70 hours per worker per week to the 40 hours or so today. A second example is looking at productivity in the household, and we see here the share of US households with the basic electrical appliances. And over the 20th century, you have this increase of diffusion of the dishwasher or of the vacuum cleaner, very important tools for your household. And if you ever lived without one of these, you know how much more work your day-to-day routine is, and how much work was actually saved by all of these. So the effect of that was that the working hours in the household decreased massively over the 20th century. This is data for the US. And it shows you also that there are these virtuous cycles that get started through through these productivity increases. And of course, this is freeing up a lot of work at home, which you can then put into to other purposes. And you can female labor participation, one of the big changes of the 20th century, is clearly related to this productivity increase in the household. So if we go back to this question of how incomes grow, we understand now that productivity increases are at the heart of this, and at each of these many things that you consume, you have productivity increases, whether it is in medicine. We talked about the Ebola vaccine this morning. That would be one example also for a productivity increase. We just heard about food and the improvements in food productivity, and all of these things added up lead to the economic growth that we witnessed over the last 200 years or so. And now I want to take a very global perspective and look at how incomes grow or changed around the world. And back in 1800, we saw that even the richest countries like England and maybe the Netherlands were the richest countries at the world. They had very, very low incomes, so income inequality was very low. Global income inequality was very, very low, but everyone was similarly poor. Now we move forward to 1988, the first year for which we have better data. This is data from household surveys, just put together. It's a very new paper by two researchers, Branko Milanovic and Christoph Lackner. And they added up the household survey information, and if we plot incomes for each person in the world on this logarithmic axis, x-axis, running all the way from $100 on the very left to $60,000 on the very right, then we see the incomes of the developed countries falling to the very right of this axis, which with a mean of just below $10,000 in 1988. If we add sub-Saharan Africa, we see that sub-Saharan Africa is vastly poorer, and the richest people in sub-Saharan Africa are actually as poor as the poorest people in the developed countries. There's almost no overlap here. Then we add the Soviet Union and Northern Africa, and we see high inequality in this region, falling in the middle. Similarly, Latin America and the Caribbean spreading all the way from the very poorest people in Africa to the very richest people in the developed countries. Much of Asia is poor in 1988, and so is India and also China. Similarly to the adjustments that were made for price changes over time, the economists go and adjust for price differences across countries, just to reflect the fact that 10 pounds don't get you as far in central London as it gets you in India, for example. So these price changes are taken into account here. And if we just look at the distribution, then we see a clearly divided world with a very rich world on the right and a much poorer world with the majority of the population on the very left. And we can also add the poverty line, and until last week the international poverty line was $1.25 per day. This was now adjusted to $1.90, but it is also this revision of the poverty line is now also expressed in 2011 dollars instead of 2005 dollars. So the purchasing power of your dollar did not change much. If we add this poverty line, we see that it falls right in the middle of the bulk of the poorer people in 1988. And now we can go and see how the world changed since 1988. If we move forward to 1993, we see that the poorer parts of the world are increasing. So the number of people in China and India and Asia especially are increasing. And then to 1998, we see how slowly the distribution on the left is moving to the right. And this continues in 2003. And then 2008, we now see that the poverty line lies to the left of this bulk. And if we continue all the way to 2011, we see that the world income distribution has changed quite dramatically. So it's this long story of increasing global inequality that we saw in the very first slides when we just looked at average incomes that actually came to an end in the 90s, and now global inequality, which is still very high. Like that's that is still a fact, but it is now falling. And if we look at the income distribution, we saw that this bimodal distribution of 1988 gave way to this unimodal income distribution that you see here. And if we just look at the shift of this distribution to the right, then we can actually study what's happening to the tail on the very left, namely global poverty. And if we plot the share of people living in extreme poverty, which, as I said earlier, is now measured by as living with $1.90 per day, or less than with $1.90 per day, then we see how global poverty over these last 200 years came down from all the way around 80 or 90% in the early 19th century. And then in the black line, you see the World Bank data where the accuracy of the data is higher, but we have to be honest, this data it's still very difficult to compare income levels, and it's also true that for many countries, the surveys could be of much better quality, let's put it like this. But if we look at the black line, and I think it's a disgrace, it's one of the most important figures that we can possibly look at. So we should, I think, put more effort into measuring it better. This data now for the last 30 years shows you that global poverty was at 44% around the time when I was born, and then dropped faster than ever in history to less than 10% in the projections for this year. And I'm doing this kind of work, I'm putting all of these things on Our World in Data because I think they're very important. They matter hugely for the quality of lives of people, but it also matters for our understanding of the world, and they're not known. In a survey by Gapminder here in the UK, only 12% of the population knew that extreme poverty was falling. The majority of the British population thought that over the last decades, the share of people in extreme poverty is actually increasing. But once you get this longer perspective and you have an idea of how it is possible that incomes grow, then it is, I think, easier or possible to understand how the world is changing. And these 12% are people with university degrees. For the general public, it's a tiny bit lower. If you want to see these visualizations on prosperity and poverty, you find them on Our World in Data, but on Our World in Data you also find how wars changed over the last decades and centuries. You find data on violence, on education, on food provision, on famines, on health, life expectancy, infant mortality, all in a series of, I guess, hundreds of data visualizations. So how does this process of increasing global prosperity continue, and how is the world changing right now? This is shown in this very last slide that shows you the annual average economic growth since the year 2000. And the darker colors show you growth rates of 6, 7, 8, or 9% per year, and we see that we have very high growth still in much of Asia and Latin America, but also Africa is now growing rapidly. And we see that generally the poorer countries now have higher growth rates, so they're catching up with the richer countries in Western Europe and North America. So it's becoming a more equal world, and I think this is something that should make us very optimistic about the future. We said at the beginning that productivity is at the heart of these income increases, and if we now have a richer world, a more educated world, we have more people that actually can contribute to the innovations that increase incomes, and we also have more people that demand these technologies and ideas. And with these words, I want to end. Thank you very much for listening.
So you're a data-led optimist?
In many aspects. I guess I mean, on this platform, I try to get an empirical perspective on how the world is changing, and I think in many things, if you zoom out, then you have to be optimistic. And, well, like, let's put it this way: if you would have predicted how the world has changed over the last 3 or 4 decades back in 1970 or so, I think people would have called you a crazy optimist. People were predicting famines in South Asia, and then none of this happened. So I guess the optimists of the 70s were actually the realists.
Thank you, Max Rosa.